Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. Kane. We're continuing our discussion of the political history of India. So what was life like in India back then?
Well, it doesn't change for a long period of time, so we can actually kind of talk about the period after the Mauryan Empire into the early AD period. India, by the 1st century AD, India is linked to the outside world, and it's seen by outsiders as a place of wealth. Arab traders are going to be going there, and of course later on Islamic traders will go there too. There's lots of trade for spices in the port cities. You have merchants coming from other places and settling in India and becoming Indianized. You have Jews and Arabs and Christians and all sorts of people coming in to trade. And you have the three of the major religions in the world, Hinduism, Jainism and Buddhism, all indigenous to the area, and they're all active through this period. By the 9th century AD, Buddhism takes a back seat, and so does the Jain faith to Hinduism, but the ideas of the other two are absorbed back into Hinduism, so actually they're kind of all there. If you were looking at the country itself, it's really a lot of things are dominated by its climate, and of course the monsoons are the most important things. The southwest monsoons cross June to September, and then the northeast monsoons cross from December to February. And it has an important impact on everything from the types of agriculture to the types of houses that you have. And it's in terms of agriculture, depending on what part of the country you lived in. And it's huge. It's a subcontinent. It's massive. So depending on what part you're in, you get different kind of things grown. So you'd get rain-fed agriculture in the northwest, so wheat and barley. In the drier areas, you get millet. The east and the south, you get rice. And then you have wet rice cultivated in the Ganges plains, and lots of cattle breeding and buffalo raising in the wet areas. They just used slash and burn agriculture, nothing really sophisticated at the first, and irrigation was just a case of taking water from rivers and diverting it into channels. But even so, they were able to harvest 2 crops a year before adding irrigation. So they're actually able to produce a huge amount of goods because of the high soil fertility. Remember, we had to wait to the Sung Dynasty and get the introduction of champa rice before we got the 2 harvests a year in China. They will benefit later on after the Islamic armies come into India. They will benefit from Islamic irrigation techniques and things like that. They needed good roads and efficient communication, for the economy, and probably most of that would be done on the river system. So, in particular, the Ganges. They had some trade by land, and they're actually, all through this period, they become increasingly more sophisticated, so that when you actually get to the medieval era, later on you get the British going there, they're shocked to find that these are people that have banks and credit and all those kind of things that we've already talked about for other places. So they exported spices, of course, and of all the spices, the king of spices is pepper. So they exported pepper, and they exported precious stones, things like indigo for dyeing. They imported horses. They didn't breed them because the climate wasn't good enough, and in fact there's a problem with cattle breeding because of that as well. The population, it's hard to judge how many people are there because the first British census is from 1881, so it's a bit beyond our period. It looks as though by about 55 BC, so just on the eve of the AD period, about 20 million people. But lots of floods, lots of epidemics, and no real sense of how that changes the population. The period that we're talking about, the medieval population, is probably close to 100 million. So remember, Europe doesn't have very many people in this period. So 100 million, and by the 1600s, it's about 150 million, and by 1881, 231 million.
Oh,
of
wow.
course, now it's massive, just like 999.999 million, or even more if you can count higher than that. And I think I met every single one when I was in
That's
when I was in
lovely.
India. So for the people, the majority of people would have been peasants. They would just produce food and create their revenues from that. They're sedentary. They're not pastoralists. Or they're not really moving around very much at all. And people were identified by caste, not by kin or clan. And I'll explain that in a minute, because we have an outside source that tells us about the caste system. You have, of course, towns as well, towns and cities. The towns start as administrative centres, and then people that move to them usually have some kind of specialised economic activity. Life is tough for most people. I would think that most people are living fairly close to subsistence. They had bonded labour, there was forced labour, and of course there were, within the caste system, we'll talk about the untouchables, the people who were out of caste and did all the really, really menial work, and anything that was considered dirty, like dealing with carcasses or tanning leather, or any of those kinds of things. On the other hand, you had local rulers, Maharajas, who, there's one example from the period that we're thinking of, who had 900 elephants, 20,000 horse, 100,000 soldiers, and 1,000 women at his palace. So you get these broad differences from the incredibly rich to the very, very poor. I stayed with the Maharaja when I was in India. It was pretty cool. Peacocks wandering around. It's kind of cool. So yeah, life is tough for most people, I would think. We have a really good description, though, from a Chinese Buddhist monk called Fa Shen, 405 to 411, traveling from China, and he's gone for like decades and decades and decades. He's all over the place. So he describes the people of India as happy, which is nice. So happy, and he said that. He talked about the caste. He said it's a happy place that really people were looked after. There's this kind of basic welfare system in place. And he talks about the caste system. And I'll just run through the names of the castes, and I'll tell you a bit more about them later on when we're talking about caste. So there's the Brahmins at the top. That's the priestly caste. So that's the elite. And then there's the Kshatriya. They're the warriors. Warriors, later on administrators. The Vaishya. They're the traders, and the Shudra are the servants, and then the untouchables at the bottom, so the outcasts or out of caste. But they also go by a number of other names. They were called Dalits, they were called Chandala, so it's a whole different set of names for them. But of course, the Dalits or the untouchables had to sound a clapper to warn people that they were coming, because their shadow could pollute you if you were from a higher caste. You'd have to go away and have a wee wash. If you got too close to the upper caste, they had to cleanse themselves. You couldn't eat with anyone from a different caste, and then the outcasts couldn't eat with anybody at all, and they would have to live on the edges of villages, so they're kind of physically separated from everybody else. So people that were butchers or tanners or executioners or scavengers, anybody that was working with what were considered to be dirty things or polluted things would be people from the outcasts. Actors, though, I'm glad to hear that, because my brother's an actor. Actors had to live outside the city as well, and their houses were marked, so I'm not sure what it was they thought so bad about actors, but little suspicious characters. Just a few general comments.
Very nice. I know the Gupta Dynasty is called the Golden Age of India. What can you tell us about it?
Okay, the Gupta are great, and of course that's why they're called the Golden Age. The
Probably could have guessed
Dynasty.
that.
Yeah,
there, Dr. K.
And with this rise and fall of empires, we're going to see the Gupta rise and fall, and then we'll see Harsha rise and fall, and then we'll see the beginning of a number of Islamic dynasties and the rise and fall of those. So the Gupta is considered to be this kind of really cool, special period where period of almost like when we're talking about Islam, that 8th to 10th century period, great intellectual vitality, lots of visits from the Islamic scholars into India and vice versa. The Gupta, their base was on the western Ganges plain. It looks as though they were Vaishya. They weren't the Brahmin caste, they were the Vaishya caste, and their rise begins under Chandragupta the First, and he marries very well, typical good diplomatic marriage into the family that was associated with the Kingdom of Nepal. and he took the title Maharaja Adhiraja, the King of Kings. So, pretty important guy. So the Gupta reign begins with him, and again, he's succeeded by his son Samudragupta, and information on his reign can be found on the Ashoka edicts, the Ashoka pillars, all through India. They conquered the area around Delhi, and then they also made the kingdoms to the south and east of them pay tribute to them, and they managed to take out about 9 separate kingdoms in the north of India. Some people have argued and argue that even after the Gupta period, that India's best understood as maybe 70 different kingdoms. Like there's that many, right?
Wow.
So he takes out the 9 kings in northern India, and he made the Rajas, so the rulers of central India and the Deccan, also pay tribute to him as well. So he manages to break the power of almost all of those rulers, maybe as far south as Sri Lanka. And if that's the case, then this is the one dynasty that actually manages to take over most of India, rather than the subsequent ones who are really good in the north of India and never really get very far south. His son Chandragupta II, 375 to 415, was seems to have been the best of all. He came to power by killing his brother, who was the heir. Always a good way to get to the top. He annexed western India and open access to the ports, and married his children to the rulers of the Deccan. So again, this kind of intermarriage of rulers, and one of his daughters ends up as a regent for her sons, and a great patron of the arts. It's a very well organized kingdom, just even in terms of politics, and I won't bore you with all the details, but there are at least 5 levels. There are 5 levels of rule. The first layer is the imperial, or the first level is the imperial level. So state rule was considered to be very light. So light rule tried to decentralize authority, and there was a chief minister that headed up the civil administration, but they're not really forceful naturally because they've taken over all these different kingdoms. So you have to kind of back off and, let things be. So the second layer was provincial. So they would have officials for each of the provinces, and these men would head provincial councils. The third level was the district level. So there's another group of officials, but see, it's all decentralized, right? It's not like the imperial guy in all these areas. The fourth level was at the village, so each village would have an assembly of village elders. And the fifth level, or the other alternate level, I suppose, was the towns, and they had city corporations, and the city corporation would have a chairman, and there were also intermediaries between each of these 5 levels. So it's really, really nicely organized. All of the revenues in the kingdom were for the king, so they were for the protection that he gave to all his subjects, and of course the military campaigns when they were needed would be financed from those revenues, from the surplus. And the king also took a share of all the grain production from the entire country, so that's why he's so wealthy. Land ownership is really interesting as well in this period, and I can't possibly do it justice, except to say that it's very complex, and it's not clear from there's a book called the Smriti, Book of Laws. One of them is the Code of Manu, and in the Code of Manu, which is considered to be kind of the law, it says one thing about land ownership, and in one of the other Smritis it says something else, so it's kind of difficult. Land was considered to belong to the village community, so it was considered to belong to the people that really farmed it, but at the same time it also was said to belong to the king. So, in the Gupta law books, you see that. So this causes problems at times, as you can imagine. If the king decides that he wants to give some support to, say, a Buddhist monastery, he might want to give the monastery a village so that it can have the revenues from the village, but the village is technically already owned by the people in the village. So, there are issues with that, and it's not entirely clear, but that's the great thing about law. Is it ever really clear?
That's why you need lawyers.
I think it is, and then it's not. That's right. So, under Chandragupta's son Kumara Gupta, he's an interesting guy because of the outside threats that he has to face, and he has to face the Huns. Maybe I should just stop there.
We'll stop there. Yeah, that does it for part 2 of our discussion.